Manager of Policy Development for the Inland Empire Utilities Agency until 2017. For many years, she was the executive director for the Mono Lake Committee. Now retired, she serves on several boards, and I have that all on our agenda. So I'm going to turn it over to Martha.
Thank you, Roberta. And I just have to say, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the League of Women Voters. My entire career started by working with the League, Polly Smith, Gloria Duncan, Karen Urquhart, later with Roberta, on water-related issues in Marin County, where I grew up. So
absolutely,
always have felt a huge debt and gratitude towards the League for such a strong foundation for my own career. As we talk about water rates, which is kind of a technical issue, I'm doing kind of water rates 101 through the lens of efficiency and equity. And I want to dedicate this presentation to Tom Ash, because Tom Ash was the staffer over at Irvine Ranch Water District who first implemented a budget-based rate structure in the country and in California. And this presentation is built on all of his work and his 30 years of advocacy for this approach to water efficiency and equity through a much more stronger budget for water agencies. He died this year. I've adapted a lot of his slides that I'm using today, and I just feel like we owe him such a debt as well for his advocacy, just fierce, that there's a better way for water agencies to meet multiple goals through their rates for their communities. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So when we talk about, the kinds of things that keep us up at night and keep our customers up at night, particularly now as we've been going through droughts and tremendous changes within our water systems. And the first question for any water manager is, what the heck? I'm losing the essential revenue that covers my fixed costs when less water is sold. What the heck am I going to do? And on the other side, you've got water customers saying, well, you asked us to save the water. Now you're raising the rates because you say you don't have enough money to cover these essential fixed costs. Water agencies end up being tremendously skeptical that customers understand what we do and the quality of our services. You get feedback from the customers. They don't understand anything on their water bill, and they're really upset. They don't think they use that much water. We look at the future, how we plan for the future and meeting reliably water demand and water quality requirements. But you have to pay for the system upgrades. So now if your populace is upset, there are going to be rate protests. You do have a lot of people now saying they can't afford to pay their water bill. But this is a huge kludge, and it's really important to think through, how do we get through this to a better rate structure that supports the agency, supports our customers, supports societal goals. So this is the foundation. This is what water rates have to solve for. We've got to get revenue stability, and that means we really have to figure out how to make sure that we've appropriately built our fixed cost into the rate structure. And I'll talk more about that. There are two types of customer satisfaction that I want to call out. One is affordability, and this gets at the human right to water and just equity within our water. And customer satisfaction in terms of fairness. We're always looking over our shoulders and saying, are they paying their fair share of the water costs? Am I doing my fair share? Water efficiency has been a lens through which we've looked at water rates for a very long time. We've actively used water rates as a messaging to the public, a rate message, to minimize water waste. I won't talk a lot about maximizing the multiple benefits, but I think most of you know that water efficiency is just intimately tied to energy usage, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, water quality issues. There's so many ways in which the choices we make about how we manage our water are really tied to quality of life across our different systems and populations. from a water agency perspective, getting your board approval is really important, and the board approval is really tied to their perception of the risk of whether or not they're going to continue to be elected. And then there's an additional twist of legality related to Proposition 2218 compliance. And this just gets at, there was a time when we were borrowing liberally from one fund and using it to pay for the costs in another fund. Proposition 218 basically says there has to be some proportionality between the cost of the services to a particular property and what those people are paying for those services. So a key challenge here, customers don't understand the real cost of water. From the standpoint of many people, the water rains, there it is, and it comes to my house. They don't think about the infrastructure that's in between. And I remember Cynthia Kohler, who's over at the Marin Municipal Water District, having an argument with one of her customers over a rate increase, where he was saying, well, water is basically free. And she said, yeah, but the next time, let me know the next time a rain cloud comes to your house, goes into your bathroom, and gives you the shower at the right time and the right temperature. All of those services of getting the water delivered to our customers are actually really primarily fixed costs. It's infrastructure, gray infrastructure, it's pipes, it's the water treatment systems. And there is big costs related to that. So here's my slide. So from the standpoint of a dilemma, most rate designs that we've had over the last few decades are really targeting a volume message. And Roberta and I and a number of us on the phone go back to the days where we were talking in the California Urban Water Conservation Council about best management practices for rate design and how important it was to send an economic signal to people that were high users that they were using too much. So the recommendation was to place the majority of the rate on the volumetric. 70% of the rate would be based on the volumetric cost, 30% would be based on the rate, on the fixed costs. And this example I'm showing is, Tom always declined to name the California city, but he was involved with an evaluation of their rate structure. And when they did their 2000 rate structure, basically the consultant was saying, oh, well, you want to do conservation, you need to further put on the variable or the volumetric side, raise those rates and decrease the fixed. Well, what happened? The city ended up losing $25 million between the time that they adopted the rate in 2012. And it turned them upside down. And when they were looking again at the rate recommendation, Tom just kind of slapped his head because he said, because they had emphasized the importance of water efficiency or conservation, they had recommended an additional increase on the variable side over the fixed. So we have water rates that when there is a lot of water efficiency, you go upside down. And that's what we're seeing in terms of the drought.
Excuse me, Martha. I'd like to ask everyone to please mute themselves, except Martha.
So another challenge I want to call out in rate design is kind of this balancing act between fairness, equality, and equity. And the picture that I'm going to focus on the left-hand side first with this picture of Chino Hills. There are 4 houses that are virtually identical conditions. There's the same year of construction. They had the same size yards. And what you see on the left-hand side is the amount of water, indoor and outdoor, that each of these properties are using. Proud to say that the property with the yellow on it is the water resources manager for Inland Empire Utilities Agency at 75 gallons per capita daily. So what we've done here is we've identified how many people are in the house that's tied to the indoor use. And then you can see her neighbors, 155 gallons per capita daily, and one really whomping 3 times the amount of water that she's using, 243 gallons per capita daily. So what's going on here in the bigger picture? Just a couple of anchor points. Number one, we've talked about conservation a lot in terms of reducing water use, but reducing water use is not the same thing as efficiency. Making what is that a reasonable amount of use for the purpose of the water being used. And we see this in the low flow toilets. You can also see it in and on the energy side with light bulbs and other appliances. But over time, we've been able to shift the efficiency of those appliances. So for low flow toilets, we used to have them at 8 gallons per flush. Now they're less than 1 gallon per flush. So that's using less water, but it's using less water in the context of a reasonable amount of use for the service that the water is being put to. And one of the things that is lost in a lot of the water conversations over the last few years is how significantly water demand has changed over the last 4 decades. Most water agencies don't look carefully enough at the trend line that's going on. And what we've seen is a significant, over the last 4 decades, a significant transformation of urban water demand. When you get into in the communities of where you see the wasted water, it's actually an interesting bipolar conversation, because there's a lot of data showing how the wealthier in our communities use more water. They typically are less rate sensitive, so the economic message is less important to them. They typically have larger landscapes to irrigate. And they tend to drive for water agencies the highest part of the cost of the system, which is how to provide reliable water supplies during the hottest, driest months of a year. So they really drive the peak use issues. The other part of it is the disadvantaged communities, and typically they're using the least amount of water, but they also have the oldest housing, the oldest appliances, the leaks. They tend to have the greatest opportunities for further improving efficiency and reducing the amount of water that they're using. And then you get into who bears the cost, and that depends on the rate structure, which is really the topic of what we're doing today. But it is an interesting point that there's a lot of examples of the poor subsidizing the wealthy. And one example would be, a lot of agencies have rebates for indoor water efficient toilets and things like that. So the question ends up being, well, who's actually benefiting from those rebates? And at one point, there were a number of agencies who were very proud of the fact that their rebate programs were so successful, they felt they had reached saturation, that there was no more market out there for that particular rebate, say for a low flow toilet. But the reality was we'd only saturated a marketing mechanism, and that overwhelmingly the disadvantaged, the low income, had never benefited from those rebates. So without a marketing program that delivered the rebate to those customers, in fairness, those customers were subsidizing the wealthy. They weren't getting the benefit of the rebate. And it's important also just to recognize, particularly now with all the changes, how many Californians qualify as low income. Some of them pay as much as 20% of their income for water. So this issue of equity and how do we work with that portion of our population that can least afford the water, at the same time, we're trying to make sure we have rates that recover appropriately costs for the water agencies, is quite a dilemma. And so it's all about the design of the structure, and all water rates are somewhat regressive. Which ones are better? Which ones are best? A uniform rate is going to be the most regressive, because all you're doing is taking the cost, dividing it by the population, and assuming equality of the shared cost somehow is equity, but it's not. And a lot of water agencies have shifted over to tiered rate structures where they're trying to connect the volume of water used and increasing volumes of water used to increasing costs. A budget-based rate structure, which is the one I'm going to be talking about today, is basically, the least regressive of these different types of rate structures. But essentially, it's a tiered rate structure where those tiers, the incremental steps, are based on more individualized water allocations. So they're individualized to the parcel and the conditions at the parcel, but you have equity or equalness because the assignment of how much water is appropriate to use is based on the same water efficiency standards, whether you're poor or you're wealthy. They're the same standard, and I'll explain that. in the graphic on the right, basically the blue is, this is an example of a water allocation. We'll come back to this one a couple of times. The blue is indoor water use. The red is outdoor water use, as you would expect. Outdoor water use is higher during the summer and the fall months. When it's hotter, more water is needed. The water budget is the lower line, and the upper line is the actual water use by this particular customer. So what you can begin to see is, relative to a budget, how much more people are using and where their opportunity is for reducing that use. So the formula is pretty basic for how water budget allocation is set. It's indoor use plus outdoor use equals efficiency. So on the indoor use, you're looking at the number of residents in a home and an estimate of what is an efficient level per person based on, usually it's on end use studies, but there's an accepted kind of average right now with 55 gallons per capita daily. So indoor use is just the number of residents times that number. Outdoor water use is a similar kind of formula. How much area around your house is being irrigated? What is the evapotranspiration? So what's the temperature in the area? Because that impacts how the plants are uptaking water. And then there's a factor called an ET adjustment factor, because the types of plants that you're irrigating and the efficiency of your irrigation system really impact how efficient that landscape is. So if you're doing a lawn, that's a really different amount of water than if you planted California poppies. There are two extremes in terms of the plant requirements for water. And then there's also embedded in that some assumptions about how efficient your irrigation system is. So again, back to the picture in the Chino Hills, the water budget allocation that was given to Chino Hills during the drought was 150 gallons per capita daily. So customers were supposed to be trying to reach that amount. And again, you find my water resources manager was at 75 gallons per capita daily. So she was well within the target. And then you have these other neighbors who are clearly far outside the target. And I just want to touch briefly that there is legislation that came out of the drought that directs state agencies to establish water efficiency standards and update these standards that would then go into allocating to agencies across California, the larger agencies, that they're going to have water efficiency targets, and these will be set by 2023, and there'll be requirements for meeting those targets in future years. So here's the basic features, and all I want to do with this slide is emphasize there is customer level data that's required in order to create these individualized customer allocations. You do need real-time evapotranspiration data. There are ways of getting that now, particularly through programs like EDF with their Open ET. You do need some sort of interaction between the customer and the agency, just because there are variances. Some people have horses, some people have swamp coolers. There's ways in which to adjust a allocation to reflect some of those bigger ticket items that may not be average water use across the population. And then it's basically turning it into these water tiers. So it's back to, this is a tiered rate structure. Blue here on the bottom is the indoor, green is outdoor. And then you have amounts of water that are being used above those basic levels. And you're tying the higher costs back into fixed cost as well as variable costs, back into what is the cost of providing the services to allow people to be at that higher level. And that's where you're starting to tie back Proposition 218 compliance with these rate structures, but also really moving away from trying to just put all the emphasis on water efficiency on the variable costs, and being able to build back the fixed costs, which are the real costs of delivering that service without losing the water efficiency message. So this is an example of a rate structure from Molten Miguel. So now if you look at the upper left, you can see that their efficient use is tier 1 and tier 2. You can actually see a little change in the cost of the water supplies based on what probably is indoor versus outdoor. And you can see they've been able to build in some unrestricted revenue offsets to even further lower these costs, so that we're really looking at what is the lowest basic cost of service that we can provide our customers who are efficient, but at the same time making sure that they are paying their fair share of the fixed costs. And then the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, supply number 2, this is where you're getting into what does it cost a water agency to make sure that they can cover the July and August peaks? What does it cost to make sure that we have additional water supplies to basically meet the demand? But how do we also send a price signal that says, you know, you're using too much. If you use less, you're going to be reducing costs on the entire agency. And so on the right is a graphic that's looking at summer peak usage for Molten Miguel. They targeted this non-point runoff that was coming off of the properties, and figured out that if they could reduce permanently that peak use, then they could eliminate the need for a $20 million recycled water storage project, which is indeed what they did. UC Riverside has done a number of papers looking at allocation-based water rates and kind of welfare impacts. They were the ones who concluded that budget-based rate structures are the least regressive of all the different forms of rate structures. And what they saw in, I think this is they were looking at Eastern's budget-based rate, they were able to reduce use by 18% without any negative impact, economic impact on the agency. And to achieve the same level of efficiency would have required a 30% increase in the water rates. So when you get into the equity discussion, this is where looking at it through the lens of real costs and how do we value efficiency in the context of the rate structure enables you to really come up with a very different approach to balancing all these different needs. This is very quickly from Tom Ash. I apologize, these are not his best slides. But they show on the left-hand side, Irvine Ranch, who actually adopted their rate structure in 1989, or 1991, excuse me, 98, yeah, 89, and then they started implementing it by 91. They were able to achieve a 55% reduction in the amount of water that they were using over 6 years. They've kept it low. They were able to avoid huge amounts of $75 million in water purchases, and they have enormous customer satisfaction. Just to touch on a multiple benefit, in the same water district, they had a lot of non-point irrigation runoff going into Newport Bay. As a result of their rate structure being implemented, they were able to significantly reduce the amount of runoff going into the bay, which has improved the water quality of the bay. So there's a lot of ancillary benefits that come from the water efficiency. And in this case, you have the rate structure working in to help make that happen. Basic, overview of who's doing the water rates. You can see they started with Irvine. You've got a couple in Colorado in the early 2000s. And then you really see between 2008 and 2017, a number of agencies now piling in, quotes in the middle about their satisfaction with these rate structures. And I just want to call out Las Virgenes because it's one of the most recent. As they were going into the drought in 2013, they were losing already $1.5 million a year. They were upside down on their rates. And they were using the reserves to try to cover the gap. But they knew they had some really big infrastructure projects coming. And they weren't going to meet the state conservation requirements as the drought was coming on. They still had too high of a water use. So their board was very unhappy. They made the decision to adopt the water rates in 2015. Since then, 2019, 4 years, they've been meeting all their cost of service. They've rebuilt their reserve. The board is very happy. They still haven't got all of their customers really into the zone, but 60% of their customers are meeting their budgets. And when they did the rate adoption, they only had 4 customers out of 23,000 who actually filed a 218 protest. Why are more water agencies doing this? Bottom line, there are a lot of myths, but it does take more data, and it does take a very different relationship between the agency and their customers. So it's hard. And as you get into the reality of this, I mean, particularly the direction that we're going in with climate change and droughts, it's really important to get this problem straightened out. And there really is a financial risk to the agencies of not changing. I realize this is an eye burner. It's Tom's words in his summary of why the results are real. In a nutshell, you're rewarding efficient users while wasteful users are being financially penalized. You've got allocations that have a high level of customer satisfaction and understanding. There have been repeated surveys of these customers in the areas that do have these rate structures that believe that these are fair, they're proportional, they have a better understanding of what their water really costs. For the agency, they have revenue stability. You're creating, through the excess penalty money, a funding source for conservation, which allows the agency to reinvest in the very customers that are wasting the water. There's a lot of other multiple benefits like water quality. And high water rates are being directed at the right target. So these are the rate structures that will do the most to help low income customers decrease their bills or have the least impact on their bills while they're still paying a fair share of the rates. And so for elected officials, this has been a big deal. This is impartial, it's scientific, it's defensible, and will be a big part of helping the individual water agencies also comply with the coming state efficiency regulations. And it's in particular, the state efficiency regulations will really, they'll have a tool by which they can comply with them. So opportunities for action, I think the biggest one is just making sure that more people understand what we're talking about with this type of rate structure. It will be important for people to get involved with the state of California process over the next 2 years. The Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board are in the process developing the efficiency standards for the state. And those standards are standards and tools that go with it that water agencies will be able to use and defray some of the costs of coming up with a budget-based rate structure. But I also want to call out that this year, by July 2021, urban water management plans are going to need to be approved by the large agencies, those agencies that serve 3,000 customers or more. And it's going to be really important to really pay attention to understanding what are the demand trends for a water agency, because so many agencies have ignored the fact that water use is going down, water use is becoming more efficient. And so they keep projecting out demands as if it was 20 or 30 years ago. And they've got those demand projections wrong. And you can, even most recently, Metropolitan Water District in, well, certainly in July, but earlier in the year, in January, we did an analysis to say we've been over projecting demand for a really long time. And so when we come to the end of the year, if we don't have the right demand projected, we don't have enough revenue to pay all our costs. And then we have to raise rates again. So it's that spiral of not understanding where we're headed and also how do we get there faster, but do it in a context of rate stability. So these are some additional resources. I would really encourage you to pop into I've given you the link. SAPA did put together a program to support their member agencies, SAPA being the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, to help their member agencies develop the tools so that they could implement budget-based rate structures. This is a video of the GMs and their finance managers talking about why they did this, how skeptical they were at the beginning, and why now they're very grateful they've made these changes. I've also called out 2 other reports that I think are interesting. One comes from the Alliance for Water Efficiency that's looking at an assessment of water affordability and conservation potential in Detroit, Michigan. They're doing another similar study in California right now. And then finally, just as part of this, looking at water demand forecasts, I really encourage you to look at the Pacific Institute's report and assessment of urban water demand forecasts in California. The graphic on the right is from that report, and it shows you how the black lines in those graphics are the actual demand. The colored lines are all from past urban water management plans. And you can see City of Sacramento is one that's up that I can see right now. You can really see how far there's out of whack the water demands that are being projected are with the actual trends on water usage. And so if there's not one thing that comes out of this, we are on track to continue to reduce demands simply because of the water efficiency appliance legislations that have gone in. Thank you, California Urban Water Conservation Council and so many others. And also because of the change in the way people are looking at their landscaping and going to more water efficient landscaping. Good for California, good for water use, but creates a challenge for water agencies. And so figuring out how to do these rate structures right ends up becoming a really foundational issue for our communities. I think that's it.
So this is Roberta. Jane, you're running the session. Shall we go to the raise your hand? Do we have that ability if someone wants to come
We
in?
probably do. I'm trying to, just a second here. I'm